Okay, so we might start. For those that have just joined us, I'll just repeat that we're going to have the presentation first, and then we will have questions. Everybody, apart from the speakers, will be on mute. When we get to the questions, if you'd like to raise your hand and we get you to ask your question online, or at any time during the presentation, you can type a question that you may have, and when we get to question time, we can include those which have been typed as well as those who raise their hands. So I'll start off by saying that on Sunday, the 30th of this month, we'll be observing World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. And this year, the United Nations is calling on governments, law enforcement agencies and public services, civil society also, to assess and enhance their efforts to strengthen prevention, identify and support victims, and end impunity. And in support of this important day, the INCU is excited this evening or this morning, depending on where you are, to welcome Dr. Amber McKinley, who will be discussing the impact of trauma on victims and witnesses involved in human trafficking. Now, Amber is an associate professor with Australia's Charles Sturt University. She lectures in human trafficking and theoretical, applied and forensic victimology, and she was instrumental in the development of the recent documentary which we made on the dark world of human trafficking, titled Trafficked to Australia. Amber is a clinical and forensic victimologist. She holds a Bachelor of Liberal Studies from the University of Western Sydney, a Master of Criminal Justice from Monash University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Bond University. Her current research includes the history of Australian familicide, victims of serial homicide in Australia, homicide solvability, the decline in homicide rates in Australia, vicarious trauma for first responders, interpersonal crimes in the Australian Defence Force, and a study of thanatology and suicide. I'm personally very keen to hear what Dr. McKinley has to say, so welcome, Amber. And over to you.
Thank you, David. That was a lovely warm welcome. Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world, welcome. David gave a great introduction. I suppose just a few photos. In terms of my background, I came to victimology very, very early in my career. I was very keen to understand why some victims did not get the services that it appeared that they should get. So I decided to start studying, but I realized that I was a very practical woman and I liked to go out and find out for myself. So the 99% of my work outside of the university studying has been with agencies who deal directly with victims. So in that left-hand side, I was a civilian member of the Talisman Sabre military task force, where I got to work with the Federal Police, the FBI, and multiple militaries around the world. I also work with the AFP in disaster victim identification and recovery, and I was honoured to be able to serve as a squadron leader within the Australian Royal Australian Air Force as a specialist reserve for 5 years. My work takes me right to the forefront, I suppose, of victims and their accounts of what happened to them. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to break the presentation into 3 sections. The first is the impact of human trafficking on victims. There's been some work done fairly recently, myself and colleagues around the world, looking at the changing face of human trafficking, particularly post-COVID, and with the increase in technology. So we'll look at impact on victims first, and then I've been researching innovation and perhaps new ways of confronting human trafficking from a border force and customs perspective. And then the last few slides will be about new research that myself and colleagues are involved in that I thought might be of interest to yourselves, and start some conversations. I don't read slides, so when I put them up, feel free to read them for yourself, and I will, I guess, fill in the background. But I have got a warning for the audience here. I will be discussing fairly graphic information about victims and their accounts, so please just be warned about that. So in terms of human trafficking, I look specifically at sexual exploitation and forced marriage, and then at debt bondage and forced labour. Of course, there are numerous other types, particularly here in Australia. Recently, I've been involved in looking at adoption and abduction, and there has been discussion for some overseas colleagues in relation to organ theft and transplant. But human trafficking is a global problem which we all are very aware of, and one of, I think, the world's most shameful crimes. It affects literally millions of people around the world and robs them of their dignity. Traffickers deceive men, women and children from all corners of the world and force them into exploitative situations every day. Whilst the best known form of human trafficking is my speciality, which is sexual exploitation, hundreds and thousands of victims have been trafficked, for the purposes of domestic servitude, of child begging, of forced marriage, forced labour, and the removal of their organs. So one of the things that research has looked at is the fact that it's human trafficking is deeply rooted in the causes that the factors that cause migration, and here are some of them. But importantly, I think something that's come to my attention recently has been the fact that post-COVID, many of the victims that I'm seeing in human trafficking are actually professionals. They're middle managers, software engineers, working people, school teachers, and so on. And this has been quite the shift compared to what I have been used to in the past 20 years of my research here. I think the reason is the World Wide Web and the spread of technology and the ability for one country to advertise work in another country as a third party, and people to be trafficked across boundaries to do what is essentially criminal work. And I'll take you a bit further into that in a second. But the ones on screen that you can see there are very significant, because they not only cause people smuggling and the reason for migration and refugee status, but also trafficking, as I said, is deeply linked. Poverty is the cause and the core of all of this, as is the lack of education for most young people in the countries that are grossly affected. But another thing that I think we as educators and researchers don't look at clearly is the fact that the people are almost always grossly affected by numerous parts of this list, not just one factor, but numerous. So if I think about the earthquakes in Turkey, the consistent and current wars within places like Syria and Afghanistan, and all of the unrest around Russia and the Ukraine, if you're looking at these lists here, you'll find that many of those will come together, and that is what we think of as the perfect storm, because it will force people to move whether they like it or not, for safety reasons, for the protection of their children and the ability to stay alive. And this is when we get offenders who will traffic those vulnerable people. Now, this particular infographic is about 3 years old, and the one significant part that has changed, but there has not been a more recent one that I'm aware of, is that the 21 million victims is now at 40 million. So that was the most recent number out of the UNODC. So I guess while you have a look at that and consider those numbers, we have to think about the most important thing, which is the human cost, because here we're talking about the profitability of it. But the human cost is so very, very significant. Not only has it affected 40 million souls and their families, friends, and loved ones, but the founder and CEO of the Footprint of Freedom and a member of the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council, Malika Oringo, believe that the only way to eliminate human trafficking is to give victims and survivors a voice and the opportunity to lead research in this. They need to really invest in the recovery of survivors, but also to invest in the aftermath of all of this exploitation, because recovery doesn't end when the person is rescued. Freedom is a whole new stage, and so is reintegration, and I'll get to that very soon. The other thing that we have to consider is that all of this is driven by our demand. So when we think about cheap products, such as perhaps the clothes we're wearing, or things we purchase for our home or for our study, computers, telephones, and so on, we want to ask ourselves, what does brand and reputational damage look like? What as citizens of our world today can we take and look at in terms of corporate responsibility and the ethics around this kind of business? Because trafficking is literally driven by our need and our demand. So I guess it's something that we should consider in the future and really want to alter in terms of the way we purchase and engage with certain products. So it's well known that the majority of persons that are trafficked are females, especially in relation to sexual exploitation and forced marriage. Women make up 2/3 of the world's human trafficking victims. The vast majority of these female victims are quite young. They are lured with false promises of employment, often raped, drugged, imprisoned, beaten, threatened with violence. They have debts imposed on them. They have their passports confiscated and are often blackmailed. For men and boys, many of the victims of human traffic for the purposes of forced labour, forced begging and sexual exploitation, as well as child soldiers. The percentage of identified male victims is disproportionately lower than that of women for a number of reasons, including the fact that for many years, anti-human trafficking legislation around the world focused specifically on women and children in trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, of which victims are mostly women, to the exclusion of males. Many different types of human trafficking mean that there are no single or victim profiles. This is something I'm asked of often. Can you tell us what the most likely profile is? And unfortunately, there is no typical person, because it depends on what country you're in and what factors impact on you and your vulnerabilities. Cases are seen all over the parts of the world, and victims are targeted irrespective of their gender, age, or background. Children, for example, might be trafficked from Eastern or Western Europe for the purposes of begging or being pickpockets. Young girls, for example, from Africa may be deceived with promises of modelling or au pair work, only to find themselves trapped in a world of sex or pornography and exploitation. For women in Asia, many are tricked with promises of legitimate work, which leads to virtual imprisonment and abuse. And for men and women alike, the incidence of those trafficked from North and South America are working usually in grueling conditions on farms. This infographic here comes from a recent report that looked at the act, mean and purpose, which of course together was the way in which human trafficking exists. So one of the ways that I like to think about training is that to think about frontline workers and how we train those. Need to keep in mind that human trafficking should not be reduced to migration, public order, or organised crime problems. It is first of all a violation against the trafficked person's fundamental rights. Therefore, the identification of particular or potential victims of trafficking should always be followed by a physical and legal protection. If the person who identifies as a victim is not in the position to offer or arrange protection, identifies the victim. If they cannot offer protection, the victim should be directed to specialised services, as an example. In the case of above, if you remove the means, then the act and the purpose cannot be fulfilled. If you look at the act of, for example, recruitment, if we are able to break the line or the action, then the rest of the formula, if you like, falls apart. So what we're looking at doing is training people to identify victims first and foremost, but also then to be able to stop what's going on. We do this by studying victimology. Here is a simple definition, if you like, written by a very close colleague of mine about what victimology is, the definition. The vast majority of victims of trafficking are not identified and consequently do not have access to their rights, including assistance and support and protection. Now, if you think about what I just said, that's the vast majority are never, ever identified. It's because of the high profit, low risk that traffickers get involved in this business for. It's also because it's difficult to identify people and very difficult to prosecute. Indeed, within the transit or destination context, the opportunity to identify victims before losing contact is extremely limited. The short period of time needs to be used effectively, efficiently, and the human traffic indicators can be very helpful in bringing clarity to frontline workers and assessments in meeting a potential victim. One of the jobs that I proudly did for the Australian Federal Police when Kabul airport fell back to in a couple of years ago was to create a very small but a compact brochure for them to be able to look at human trafficking in crisis and be able to identify victims in crisis situations. And it's a key thing because you get a very short period or window in which you can identify a person. In terms of victims and their impact, in more serious cases, you'll note the ones that are on the screen now. These are physical health and any changes that may occur to the victims involved. One of the issues that I have with the way Google or our image-based stock, photo stock presents human trafficking victims is they're often bound and they've got chains or they've got masks or they're battered and so on. And of course, tragically, this is true. But for the vast majority, they are not bound. They are bound coercively. They are lured and deceived. It is not necessarily physically chained. So although many of these things on screen are true for a lot of victims, for many, they won't literally be seen as broken or chained or tied or anything. What you'll see is a person under severe duress. In terms of their mental health, which of course is the other portion to the puzzle, we think about things such as PTSD, which is obviously incredibly significant. However, unmet mental health needs may increase the risk of human trafficking. And trauma from trafficking, victimisation contributes to a wide range of adverse mental and behavioural health conditions. Studies show that individuals who have experienced trafficking may exhibit signs of severe anxiety, emotional numbness, memory loss, and depression. They may develop into PTSD, as stated on the slide. But one of the most important things we have to consider here is the lasting impact on interpersonal relationships that may have been there in the first place, such as parents to a child who is trafficked or partnerships and intimate partners, but also very, very importantly, the intergenerational cycle of victimisation and trauma, which tragically we're seeing far too much of. So they're the things that we can see. They're the things we can medicate for. They're the things that you can see a specialist about. But the ones that I have up on screen now are your intangible losses, your indirect costs. If we think about that, the indirect cost of an intangible loss, think about things like loss of productivity from that human being, loss of output caused by the crime, deducting the value of compensation if they could get it, or costs recovered, and then add costs incurred by governments, businesses, individuals and households in preventing and responding to these crime types. It's extraordinarily complex. If you think about the type of things that are on the board, long-term chronic illness, for example, puts a burden on the individual that is ill, but also significantly on the community in which the person lives. Long-term mental illness can cause suicidal ideation, breakdowns in the individual. But also things like if the victim is returned. So say, for example, a person was trafficked into Australia. The victim is assisted by our law enforcement. They are then recovered and returned to their home country, if that is where they go. They have to reintegrate back into either their home or their town or somewhere where they're safe, and they need to gain employment or at least welfare benefits. And in many of the countries we deal with, there isn't such a thing. So it would be employment. And if they don't, then the cycle is not broken, because the person can fall back into a significant state of vulnerability and actually be re-traumatized and re-trafficked. And sadly, this is something we see far too much of. So on screen now are some of the places that a victim can be identified, and I mean quite literally, where you will see people. And it's important, I suppose, at this stage to have the concept of the multi-agency approach to this, because as you'll see here, you've got NGOs, you've got missing persons, immigration, law enforcement, border checkpoints, and so on. So it's very, very important that we consider going forward, if we're educating people in customs and border force, that we consider that this is a multi-agency approach. If we think about victims in transit, about how you identify one person in 1,000 people or 100 people in 1,000 people. You can see by this photograph taken here in an African nation, you're talking about, in some cases, hundreds of thousands. If we think about Russia and the Ukraine, at the moment, my last count, I believe, was around 14 million people had moved in the last 12 months. So it's significant. So if you think about at-risk migration, let's call it that, on the move, whether it's between over countries' borders or inside country borders, most individuals are in a position of vulnerability based upon things like their age and gender, their legal status. Are they paperless? Have they a disability, or are they socioeconomically distraught? Have they got a lack of education or poverty? Stranded or undocumented migrants, unaccompanied or separated children. Young women and girls travelling alone without family members. This is something we've seen a lot in the Ukraine because the men are held in place by the war. People like pregnant women and persons who were previously exploited, so victims of other crimes. If you consider those people who have gone through or are currently going through war, then consider the fact that they're already suffering physical and psychological trauma, and what it means again to move, what it means again to be unsafe and have unsafe housing, as an example. I know the places that I have travelled to in the world where I see people that have plastic sheeting as their front door and that, and I often wonder how they sleep, quite literally. Are they safe? Do they sleep at all, or do they sleep only at its lowest level, if you like, because they're trying to protect their possessions and their families? Evidence of being controlled physically or psychologically is something that we would look at in terms of victims in transit. Identifying or asking them about where they left from. So where was their original place, and where do they are they intending on going? What about an inability to speak for themselves if they can't share their own information because they don't have it? Information provided by someone else who accompanies them is an identifier. The loss of control of one's own identification documents, such as their passport, having few or no possessions, owing large debts, and the loss of sense of time and space, particularly things like when we have people entering a country in the dark. They don't actually, they are unable to orient themselves. Importantly, the last point here I raised earlier about high profit, low risk. This is a business model. And some of our future research is looking at disruption of business models around human trafficking, because if it's worth so much money and it hasn't got much risk, and I'm not sure what countries I'm speaking to here, but certainly in Australia, we're looking at around a 2% prosecution rate, then we want to attack the business models and see if we can't stop some of this happening by making it not such a high profit. So if we think about a person in transit but under escort, these are some of the issues that will cause vulnerability. I think one of the things that I have seen the most is either the hypervigilance of a person, knowing that they're being watched, pardon me, and that they won't speak alone, that they're often accompanied by somebody who will try and speak on their behalf. This is the type of work that we're currently researching in terms of assisting Border Force and Customs in different nations to train people to be able to identify those passing through or across borders. So this is the secondary part of this presentation, and I want to think about information relating to technologies to help identify patterns and trends, potential networks involving trafficking, allowing authorities to target their efforts more effectively. So data analysis and technology. Almost all of our agencies, whether here in Australia or our other Five Eyes nations and those in our tiers, even 2 and 3 nations, still have data sets. We have increasing technology used around the world, and I think it's critical that we start to invest in people, one, learning it. So people in universities learning about the mathematics and the data analysis and the use of technology, but also all of our agencies and our governments investing in doing this, because with that data, we're able to do everything from tracking to supporting prosecution, to be even preventative mechanisms, because if we can see patterns forming, then we can break patterns down. Collaboration and information sharing is as it says, but one of the things that I noticed with my work with a number of NGOs internationally is they have a lot of information that rarely ever gets spread around. They try, but for many of their agencies, there's either a lack of interest or not enough support for the NGO to be able to spread the word and get out information. But they're actually dealing with their victims and survivors face to face, often on a daily basis. And they have great impact on things like medical services, psychological service. If it's sexual servitude and exploitation, they may have specialized services, whether it be forensics or health to prevent any illnesses and or unwanted pregnancies, etc. But they are a wealth of information. So setting up innovative platforms and networks is definitely a way that we could attack this particular type of crime. The other one is, as I have mentioned earlier about the different ways to victim identification, is to create technology-based recognition tools. We know about facial recognition, we know about all the other things that are occurring in the world, but we do have a lot of missing information, and we don't have networks that necessarily speak to one another. So this is another thing we need to look at from a research perspective, that we will get from I think, victim and survivors, as well as groups that support them, because they'll be able to tell more of the account of what it is like on the ground. And then our law enforcement, our customs and our border force can learn from that and actually develop new systems. A new one for me, and forgive me, I'm a little technophobe here, but a new one for me is the concept of blockchain technology. Blockchain is a digital leader, a database where encrypted blocks of digital asset data is stored and chained together, forming a chronological single source of truth for data. Digital assets are distributed, not copied or transferred. And this is incredibly clever and really interesting from a law enforcement point of view, because if we're talking about being able to have a single source of truth in data, we may be able to stop traffickers hiding evidence and or attempting to manipulate evidence, which again would assist us in, one, reinforcing the account that the victims give, but also in breaking down the lies. Another, which of course is thriving in terms of technology, is social media. One of the projects that I am currently looking at is social media and the missing and the long-term missing in terms of our trafficked victims. People, again, such as those in warfare and in war areas and civil war for long periods, we are able to look at certain pages and platforms that are set up for these missing persons. There may be private pages. In Australia, we have the Red Hearts campaign for missing and murdered women and children, but there are those all over the world. And social media is an amazing place to either spread the message or be able to track information. Law enforcement, certainly here in Australia, is using it a lot more. And I think one of the things it can also do is assist in identifying perpetrators, which hasn't been done too much in the past. Staying with technology, the hotline and mobile apps, the majority of people around the world, even in some of our poorest nations, still have access to mobile phones. And these platforms are a way that we can move and share information anonymously, which is actually important, but increases and assists people like the border force, customs, law enforcement, but also support services in assisting and identifying victims. So, innovations in practice. I think training for awareness for the signs of trafficking, some of which I've shown you in this presentation, and victim identification is some of the most important things that we can do. The multi-agency approach is incredibly important, because as silos and not sharing information, we either double up on work that we're doing, or we miss out key groups of critical typologies within the human trafficking area. It also, if you think about how agencies, universities and corporations can help with skills training, internships and so on to get people involved, even volunteer work, and also offering training and perhaps even like that online campus training to reinvigorate every year to let people know of new things that are coming out, whether they say they may be current employees of Border Force or Customs, and teaching them about the new and latest stuff. I mentioned here about creating digital platforms, but it's something that is important in terms of not only information sharing, but obviously it's got to be of benefit to those who are stakeholders. So asking them what they need, asking people what they want to share, and how we can involve ourselves in, say, cross-pollinating for research is incredibly important. The third point down there about supporting research in the area, we have amazing international subject matter experts in this field, and I think it's really important, and this as an example that David and the INCU have done is a marvellous way of bringing people together of like minds. The enhancement of the mobile apps, as I've said, there is also important because the geospatial information can be utilised, but also spread from law enforcement. I've put on the bottom of that, I'll let you read the slide, but blogs and podcasts are also becoming an extraordinary way to share information. Not only interviews of people that are interested, but for our students who are able to listen to these as opposed to reading, perhaps as they travel to and from university or work, but also short, sharp information about new and inventive ways of tackling this very complex problem. Collaboration in future research with the interplays of technology. I'm going to show you our new research in the next slides, and it's incredibly rich in terms of technology and the effect of facilitated violence. But things like, if you are part of a university or a group of people holding an event to raise awareness about this kind of thing, hopefully the research that I show you that we're looking at will be of interest, and you're almost always welcome to contact me. My details will be on here at the end. But looking at I guess spreading the word, reaching out and talking to people who may have done the work previously and or are interested in doing it now. So the final portion of my my presentation, there's only a few more slides to go, is new research. Please note the next one is related to pornography. It's the topic alone. It's something that has not only frightened me, but has sent me down a pathway. As you can see here, once the invasion of the Ukraine occurred, there was a 600% increase of people searching for refugee porn. It's frightening, it's happening, and it is absolute under no circumstances alone for the Ukraine. We are seeing coming out of India, Afghanistan, a number of Middle Eastern countries where actual sites are being set up on standard Google searches. I'm not talking just about the dark web. And what concerns me greatly here is, apart from the incredible vulnerability of this, you may think to yourself, well, you know, there may be, for example, sex workers who used to be sex workers in the Ukraine or Russia, as an example here, have now moved and are doing sex work elsewhere. And I don't doubt that's true. However, for the large majority, it will be that it is out of desperation, coercion, duress, and absolute force. But to consider that the demand has increased 600% in little over a year, does not give me much hope or faith in mankind. Hope I have, faith perhaps not. The next one is a fairly recent concept of technology facilitated coercive control. It's in terms of coercive control itself, it's in the last 2 years, Australia's been doing work on this for domestic and family violence related and sexual violence related. But I have now been working on human trafficking and the technology facilitated coercive control. And the reason it's important, and very specifically I'm working in terms of trafficking, is because for the vast majority of people that start in their own nation and are coerced into or are sold into trafficking, it's first they meet in person and the rest is done using technology. So either platforms, WhatsApp, etc. They will then engage with the person. So it may be a relative or a friend or a lover or an ex or whatever. But the technology part in terms of its coercive control is listed specifically there in terms of its symptomology is number 3. So shame and despondency, elevated symptoms of stress, anxiety, hypervigilance, etc. Now this may be because of isolation. So it can be that the person is removed from their known place of origin and taken away, It can be that they have been physically shamed, such as raped and filmed, and or have had a consensual sexual relationship, but have had it non-consensually filmed or photographed, and it's being used against them. This is known as technology facilitated abuse or image abuse. But from a coercive control point of view, the specific aspect of that is that it is almost always done without permission, but it's almost always done in isolation. So they start to pull the victim away from their networks of people and support, and that's how they get away with it. In terms of technology facilitated sexual abuse, that's quite a specific violent act. TFSV is known to have serious and lasting impact on victims involved. Some of the ways that it can impact them, it can lead to hostile in online environments with victims facing ongoing intimidation, threats and defamation. The constant harassment can further contribute to emotional distress and a sense of vulnerability. The distress caused by the violation can lead to sleep disturbances, appetite changes, and overall deterioration of physical health. In some cases, the victim may self-harm or experience suicidal ideation. Victims may face difficulty in pursuing educational career opportunities due to the potential exposure of private information or intimate content, and fear of further victimisation may result in social withdrawal or isolation. So if you could imagine being a human trafficker, it's the most perfect way to get somebody away from a group of people and literally disappear them. Victims could struggle to trust another, to experience difficulty in forming new relationships, and face challenges maintaining the existing ones they have. The public nature of technology facilitated sexual violence can lead victims to victim blaming and stigmatization, further exacerbating the impact of on the individuals. Excuse me. They also may face legal challenges when seeking justice or including difficulties in identifying or prosecuting perpetrators, navigating complex legal systems and preserving evidence. Think about it if this occurs in a nation that you are not native to and your language is not, it might be a second language. They could encounter skepticism, disbelief, or victim blaming attitudes from family, friends, or even law enforcement. Such responses compound the trauma experienced by the victim. A violation of privacy and loss of control and fear of being exposed or humiliated can have long-term emotional consequences. Another research project that we've been looking at is unreported homicides, or what is known as the dark figure of homicide. And this is critical in terms of human trafficking, because for many of them, basically what we're saying is people are murdered and are never ever reported as being as being deceased. So let me give you an example. There are a number of accounts where large shipping companies, and I'm talking those, massive container ships, have left one port with, say, 50 personnel and have arrived at their destination port with 3 different ports in between. Or sometimes no ports in between, and only have 47 people on board. Where did the other 3 go? And there's been a long list of questions put to the pilots, captains, and staff. People have been murdered and there have been charges brought, but in other cases, bodies are never recovered and logs are changed. If we think of the terminology boat people, say, for example, a boat enters or is incoming towards Australia, but has not yet entered Australian waters and are currently in international waters. But the boat is overloaded and we don't have names of who is there because they have escaped their country of origin, and or are trafficked and are not recorded. And then they subsequently die if the boat has capsized, but more importantly, if they are harmed, murdered and thrown overboard. We are actually never we don't ever record them. And if they're lost at sea, they are not recorded as having ever been alive, let alone dead. We have long-term missing in terms of our human trafficking victims who have never been found. Family and friends are often aware the victim, unaware the victim has been trafficked. So they believe that their son or daughter, husband or wife, or whomever the person is, has gone for a better life in a different country, and may never have arrived in that country, or have their lives been taken. We have what is known as unequivocal deaths. For those of you that have not heard that term before, this is one where a medical examiner or forensic pathologist cannot tell whether the death was purposeful. So it is put down as unequivocal or by misadventure. But unequivocal is when somebody, for example, we may have skeletal remains found, or we may have a body that is so badly decomposed we can't tell why or how they died. And we know that there are numbers of these in relation to human trafficking and smuggled persons around the world. Death in crisis, natural disaster zones, or war. You may go, well, of course, we understand that because we know that that exists, and we know that we have bodies. What I'm getting at is when there is let's say, a natural disaster of a building collapse because of an earthquake, but then a person is killed via a murder, and then their body is placed into the rubble. This has been done in the past, and there has been records written about bodies that have been discovered in unknown origins. And of course, war is a fairly simple one as well in terms of how to dispose of people. And of course, the last is falsified documents covering the death of a victim. So this is research that myself and my team are currently doing. It is tragic, but I think something that needs to be done to recognise that there are, in fact, people who have lost their lives and we're not aware. So my last slide is my concluding slide, and I really thank you for the opportunity to present today, but also for you joining me. I've tried to put it all together, I suppose, in as tight a conclusion as I can, but I suppose these are the 4 points that I'd like to make. The first is continue education, training, and of course planning collective actions. Never ever forget the multidisciplinary approach is the best, because that way we can share each other's knowledge and strength. And people like me, you know, we are often looking for researchers to work with and grants and so on. So we do that together. In order for victims to, as I put, fall through not to fall through cracks, we have to enhance our frameworks and collaborate far more closely on looking at those internal displacements, but also the international protections. And of course, the very last one, which is key for me, is to destroy the business model, to start to break down those high profit business models and fight the impunity of perpetrators. So, David, here's my details there for anybody that would like to contact me, but thank you. I'm thrilled.
Thank you, Amber. That was absolutely brilliant. And we will open for questions in a moment. But I'd like to just let you know, Amber, that you did say during your presentation, you're not sure, who is listening in on this. Well, I can tell you that we have a number of people from the University of Customs and Finance in Dnipro in Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
So what you've been saying is very pertinent. So, and they have responsibility for teaching and educating the customs staff in Ukraine. They have a very difficult job to do at the moment, and we're going to be speaking to them tomorrow, in fact, on a related issue. But just to let you know that the message was very pertinent tonight. Thank you for that. And I will open it for questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. But something that I'd just like to ask you, I know I've asked you a few times in the past, but you say it's high profit, low risk. And so when you look at the numbers and it's low risk, what are your thoughts in terms of what governments are really doing, really trying to do to stop this heinous crime? Or are they just turning a blind eye? Or are certain governments doing it? Or are they just, saying that this is what we're doing, but not really, their heart isn't in it, their real policy priorities are not there?
Yeah, David, I think it's sadly a continuum. We have, at the very highest end, we have governments actively engaging and working with stakeholders and really creating frameworks, legislation, policies, and that to really reinforce, to support their law enforcement, customs and border force to break these down and to really target those business opportunities and the ways money is being moved as people. We then have the worst end of the spectrum, where sadly we do have agencies, governments, and other forces who are corrupt in behaviour and are not doing what they can do for their own people or the people that surround their borders. But the vast majority, I believe, are trying, and certainly from the research we do, we're seeing things come in leaps and bounds. I think COVID had an enormous effect on people's ability to process this information. I think governments moved finances into other areas, as you could well imagine, for health and safety reasons, and perhaps the money was then diverted away from these programs. But I think that if the vast majority of governments can continue to target very specifically I suppose the obvious things, such as work that we're currently doing, Michelle Moore and I from Maysot in Thailand are looking at the role of women as an example, as offenders. Many of our legislations in different nations don't even consider women as offenders. So the legal framework has to be changed, because we know for many, particularly Southeast Asian countries, women are the people who buy and sell. They are the people in the market, and they are also related to trafficking and markets in trafficking. So I think, to answer your question, majority of governments are doing well. There's a lot more to be done. And if they can target the financial aspects and start to break down the financial benefits that these individuals and organised crime groups gain by buying and selling people, then they'll be a lot more successful.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of work to be done, isn't there? There's an awful lot of work to be done. And I note that Michelle is with us this evening.
Hi, Michelle.
And we don't have any hands. I think you've absolutely slayed everybody. You've really delivered a very powerful presentation tonight, Amber. Look, if there are no questions of Amber, I'm sure she'll be very keen to receive any emails. You've got her.
Yes, feel free.
And as I said, that on Sunday the 30th, it is World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, and Amber was instrumental in helping us put together the documentary that I mentioned earlier on about Traffic to Australia. And it's a very good documentary. It's an hour of documentary. Amber delivers the human trafficking course or subject at Charles Sturt University. And initially we put together this documentary just as a training aid, really, for that particular course. But when we saw the reactions and the responses from the people that were being interviewed. We just knew that we had to make it available to a far broader audience internationally. And it's a very good training film. And if I'm sure if you're writing to Amber, she'll give you the link.
Absolutely.
The YouTube link for the documentary, or if you write to myself or to Mikhail, we'll provide that to you. But look, Amber, I would like to really thank you sincerely for speaking to us tonight. It's been very heartfelt. You can tell that Amber is very passionate about her subject. She's a real advocate, and we really appreciate what you've given to us tonight, Amber. And it is being recorded. Thank you, Amber, for allowing us to record it. And what I'd like you to do, Mikhail, if you could just unmute everybody, because I think it's only fitting that we thank Amber for what she's done. Are you able to unmute, Mikhail?
I have to do it. Have to actually request them to unmute themselves.
Oh, so you're now able to unmute yourself. So if you would like to do that, we'd appreciate that. But look, Amber, thank you very much for all you've done this evening. We wish you well in your future research.
Thank you.
I'm sure you've encouraged a number of people to look into this much closer. And once again, thank you very much. So please join me in thanking Amber. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will see everybody again in 1 month's time. And for the next seminar, please keep your eye on the INCU website. But once again, thank you so much, Amber. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Take care, everyone. Thank you. And please reach out if you would like to contact me. Please feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.